Well, greetings and welcome to our Friday night Bible study. This will be for Friday, May 17th. We're already more than halfway through the month. That happened at noon yesterday for those people who are into that kind of thing, anyway. And so we're on the downhill side of the month, I guess you could say. and We had some events this week that we're not going to be talking about. They're a little bit embarrassing, but other than that, we had a good week. And so, nothing particularly interesting in the news that I saw, and I do have a Bible question. So I think I'll go ahead and do the Bible question now. I will also note that next week is our week to do a sermon presentation. And since I forgot to do the lawn this week, I get to do a sermon presentation and the lawn in the same week.
Why don't you get the neighbor's sons to do it?
Yeah. Yeah, the neighbors.
So me and the good customers, well,
The neighbors.
The customer's always right.
We found out several weeks ago that one of the workers at the medical supplies store that we attend quite a bit um, is the son-in-law to the lady who lives across the street from us, sort of our neighbor. And I think I mentioned during the solar eclipse, this lady's family got over there and all the kids were there and they made a big event of it. And so I was out there watching the solar eclipse. They were over there and the kids were oohing and awing and shouting and just having a grand old time. Then I went over there about a week ago, and there was somebody different there that I sort of recognized but didn't. He recognized me, but he couldn't place me, and so we just parted. We didn't know where we'd seen each other until he showed up at our house this week to deliver something, and then he knew where he'd seen me because he's the son of the lady next door, and he parks his pickup in our driveway from time to time when he comes over to do his mother's lawn. Well, here's the Bible question. I got it. In fact, I knew I had it last week when we recorded last week's study, but I didn't have time to try and answer it before I got the recording done. So I went ahead and answered it later, and here it is. And it comes from the old dog, and that is spelled D-A space O-L-D space D-A-W-G, the old dog. Do you think it's easy to get to hev or hard? I think it must be hard, for the gate is wide that leads to disu, D-I-S-U, and few, F-E-V, that will find it again. I am sorry for my several spaces, sorry spelling. Yeah, well, any rate, I got the idea. Dear, and I put in quotes, old dog, thank you for visiting our site and for submitting your question about getting to
I
heaven.
think that might have been vegetarian cussing.
I don't think so. He spelled it's I-B-T, and
No, I mean, sorry about my spaces spelling.
yeah,
I think that might have been vegan cussing.
maybe. It's all lowercase. There's not a capital letter in it too. But it's we're not picking apart the question. We're trying to answer the question. You
Oh, let me
research.
pick it apart.
What'd you say?
Let me pick it apart.
Why?
Because I'm in that kind of mood.
Oh,
Um,
You're
I
acting
said,
like your
I'm
cats.
sorry, something's happened here in this house. Poor Autumn is in the house with 3 women, and all of us have gone stark raving mad.
Yeah,
And he's having to tolerate all 3 of us.
the cats are busy knocking things off. That's what cats do, but they have taken
And I've
to
been reacting to it.
with a real vengeance. So they're knocking a lot of things off every day.
And I'm reacting to it, which is they're reacting to me being upset with them.
Yeah. You
And poor
refer to
Autumn is having to deal with it all.
yeah. You refer to the text from Matthew's account of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Here it is with the surrounding verses for context. So, in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow is the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. Matthew 7, verses 12 through 15.
False prophets and ferocious wolves.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now that sure does ring a bell. A video that we listened to where the prophet went absolutely haywire because somebody dared
Criticize what he had done.
they didn't like the program he had set up, and he went absolutely nuts on them.
Well, they were having a men's conference, and so they had monster truck event, followed by a sword swallower on a pole. And one of the people associated with the event had the temerity to criticize the pole dancer as exhibiting the spirit of Jezebel. And the person who had set all this up, like you say, went absolutely bonkers, called on him to repent, etc., etc. You don't question the choices of the leaders of this church. You're undermining the authority of the leaders of this church, blah, blah, blah.
Well, the pole dancer had in the past been a male stripper,
Yeah.
but he gave his heart to the Lord and joined the church. And the church is supposed to be welcoming. And he is still an entertainer, and he's strong enough and talented enough to make use of the pole, and he put it into his sword swallowing exhibit.
Yeah.
And the guy, another pastor, took offense at the fact that there was a pole used, because poles are used by
In strip clubs, girls dance on poles.
well, firemen also use poles.
Yeah, well, you know, the point we were making is that these people are
You know what
acting
you just
out.
said. I don't remember what you said, but it brought back to mind about the prophet being. What did you say?
Well, I read out of Matthew. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves.
And he acted like a ferocious wolf when his
Authority was challenged.
programming was questioned.
Yeah. The Jews used the term law and the prophets to refer to the Old Testament. Jesus summarized the entire Old Testament in just a few words leading up to the text you reference. There are two ways to interpret the narrow gate comments. Jesus might be telling us how hard it is to avoid destruction and find life. The other possibility is that he comments here on the number of people who find destruction versus those who find life. Two factors favor the latter interpretation. First, we find Jesus' words to close the section, "Only a few find it." Second, the preceding verse states a very simple approach to living that meets the requirements of the Old Testament. Simply treat others the way you would want to be treated if you were in their situation. The problem is that while such an approach to life isn't difficult to understand, our fallen human nature makes it very difficult to pull it off in everyday living. Evolution bears part of the blame for that. When we face imminent threat, such as a lion in the street, a quick reaction, fight, flight, freeze, can make the difference in if we survive or not. Stopping to rationally work out our options might take too long. So when we face a perceived threat, our bodies shut down our rational mind and our lower emotional brain, the limbic brain, I didn't put that in here, but that's what it is, takes over. Imagine this scenario. You see colored lights flashing behind you when you're driving, and you glance at your speedometer and see that you have exceeded the speed limit. You feel a spurt of adrenaline as you imagine the fine the officer might impose after he pulls you over. Now, let's suppose that your mode of dealing with threats, out of the fight, flight, freeze options, is flight. Your rational brain would tell you that a $250 speeding ticket for a civil infraction would be a whole lot less trouble than a felony fleeing conviction. But your body, full of adrenaline, has shut down your rational mind and left your emotional brain in charge. If you live in my state, and the officer that lights you up works for the state police, they'll likely perform a TVI, tactical vehicle intervention, or pit maneuver, to end the chase, even at very high speeds. That's an extreme example, but we often make poor choices in daily interactions with others based on the same mechanism. Few people find the power to overcome those forces, likely because of social and cultural ignorance. But God purposed, as soon as our first parents believed the deceiver's lies and, quotes, ate the fruit, to fix and redeem the species we call Homo sapiens. Jesus provided a way for God to transform our minds. See Romans 12, verse 2. Once the Holy Spirit begins that transformation, we will find it easy to live by the principle Jesus spelled out in that first verse we quoted. So, in that sense, it is easy to find life and avoid destruction. In the sense that both evolution and our culture have biased us against it, most people find it extremely difficult to escape the fate imposed by sin. And then in parentheses I put, the wages of sin is death. By the way, there is no correlation between intelligence and ability to spell. The transforming work of the Holy Spirit results from our personal relationship with our Creator. one tool for establishing and boosting that relationship is regular Bible study. So I encourage you to make such Bible study a part of your life. Sincerely, me, and so forth. And I thought of it after I had finished and sent this answer off, that the concluding text also bore relevance in determining what Jesus meant. Because right after saying that very few people find life, he goes on to warn about false prophets. Why do so few people actually find life? Because they have attached themselves to false teachers, false prophets, people who claim to speak for God, but who don't, and who tell them, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do the other thing, follow these rules and you'll be okay. And so they follow the rules and they never get around to character transformation, and so they fail to find life. And so Jesus.
The question is, are our beliefs something we have chosen for ourselves, or are they something that has been imposed upon us?
Well, I wanted to talk about that too. And I think one of the reasons that so few people escape destruction is because we are so caught up in truth, what we call truth, and we're highly focused on being right, on having the right ideas, the right teachings. And we get so caught up in that we forget that truth is not a doctrine. Truth is not a mental concept. Truth is a person. Amongst other things, Jesus said, I am the truth. Truth is a person, not an idea or a doctrine or a teaching or anything like that. So, if we want truth, we need Jesus.
Somebody once said that truth is truth. It doesn't change. It is our concept of truth that changes. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that person probably had the idea that truth is a mental concept rather than truth is a person. If we have Jesus, we have the truth. Various mental concepts and teachings are out there, and some of them are more useful than others in linking us to Jesus. So, yeah, we want to beware of false prophets because they can point us in a direction that leads us away from Jesus. But we find truth in Jesus, not in a specific list of teachings or Bible interpretations. Different people interpret the Bible differently. They come up with different ideas. And if we are to have unity, then we have to allow for those differences, and we have to love each other enough to grant each other the right to believe what we choose to believe without having to argue with them or sanction them or force them, coerce them to believe like we believe. If they have Jesus, they have truth. What they teach, as long as it doesn't lead them away from Christ, isn't a problem. That was a tale you just saw.
I hate to tell you this, but I'm not going to last this whole hour and a half, how long you're going to be.
You're going to fall asleep.
I'm ready to scream here in a bit. I need those things back on my legs.
Yeah, I wish I knew how to pause this. If we could pause it, then we could keep going and I could get in there and do that.
I'm sorry.
Um, yeah.
Well,
Let me do something here real quick.
talk while you're putting them on me. Tuba grip. I have to use tuba grip. I have this condition called lymphedema. My lymph glands have been destroyed by prescribed medication. And I'm in pretty bad shape. I can no longer get around without, I can't even leave the room without help.
Mia, your claws are problematic.
I have to use these compression devices on my legs. And I just got out of the shower a bit ago. We were hoping to keep them off my legs. Are you going to come back here or not? I'm trying to keep people outside while you.
If you will be quiet long enough, I looked it up. I will pause the recording and come in there. How's that sound?
Okay.
Let's see if this works. Yeah.
Well, you're not paused. I still hear you.
You know, she could walk right over there and put her nose in the dish, but no, you got to jump up on the chair and look at it like, well, now how do I get down there to eat it?
That leg feels better. Thank you. My toes curl backwards.
Better?
Yeah. And you rub your thumb between my toes. And well, not like that. I mean, when you get it out, it feels like there's some grit. Probably just dry skin. Thanks. Leave the door open. The cat's warm now. I don't want her doing what she did during the week.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, that looked like it paused the recording, so let's hope it did. The clock stopped, and the instructions I read here didn't work exactly, but I may have to do more reading later to figure out what was going on there. At any rate, we were talking about false prophets and about truth and about the importance of having Jesus, because Jesus is truth, and that mental concepts and Bible interpretation are less important. They're not unimportant, because incorrect interpretation can lead us away from Jesus, but that's the extent of it, and we really need to learn to live in love, which is the focus of the passage leading up to Jesus' prayer for unity in the church. And so it is the foundation of unity in the church when
Well,
the members
look
live
at
in
the
love.
quote at the top of the group. Greg Boyd.
Mm-hmm. In other words, we need to examine teachings if they portray God as something less than love.
Right.
But even amongst his followers, they don't always agree. He wrote a 2-book series on interpreting the Old Testament, and somebody who worked closely with him helped him do a lot of the research for that. And that person did not agree with his idea. He helped him anyway. That's how love works.
But they remained close friends.
Yeah. Well, I think we need to go ahead and get started. We've blown almost a half hour here on the question and nattering, so let's bow our heads. Our Father, we thank you for your blessings. We thank you for helping us to survive the week that is past, and for preparing us for this time that we can spend together, opening your word and seeking to know you better. We want the Holy Spirit to be part of this so that we are guided correctly and not incorrectly, so that we avoid the snares of the false prophets. Send the Spirit now, then, is our prayer in Jesus' name. Amen. Give myself a little bit of room there. I was a little bit tied up to the table. Well, here we are. We have 10 chapters left in the book of Genesis. There's 50. So 41 is 10th from the end. And there's quite a bit of story here to go. Now, if you've been with us, then you know we're going through the story of Joseph, and how his brothers sold him into slavery, how he ended up in Egypt, how he won favor with his owner, and ended up in charge of the entire household, how the owner's wife took offense at this, and either through her own lust or just through jealousy, attempted to destroy him. And when she couldn't destroy him by getting him into her bed, she lied and said that he tried to force her. And
No. Potiphar didn't believe her, because he would have had Joseph immediately executed if he had believed her.
yeah.
Which was a slap in her face. That says a lot for that marriage, doesn't it?
Well, hasn't marriage been that kind of a thing ever since humans dreamed it up? Because of our greed?
Ever since Adam threw Eve under the bus?
Yeah, To a certain extent, yes.
But didn't God predict it?
Well, he did, yes.
He didn't ordain it, but he predicted it.
Yep. At any rate, we're ready to start chapter 41, and having gotten into prison and then having gotten into a position of trust in the prison and having interpreted dreams for the two men, the two royal officials who got thrown into prison with him. One of them died and the other one lived, as Joseph predicted based on the dream interpretations. But the one who lived, having promised to tell Pharaoh what was up with him, completely forgot and didn't mention it for 2 years. So here we are, 2 full years later. In other words, 2 more birthdays. Pharaoh's now 2 years older. Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing on the bank of the Nile River. In his dream, he saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing in the marsh grass. Then he saw 7 more cows come up behind them from the Nile. But these were scrawny and thin. These cows stood beside the fat cows on the river bank. Then the scrawny, thin cows ate the 7 healthy, fat cows. At this point in the dream, Pharaoh woke up. But he fell asleep again and had a second dream. This time he saw 7 heads of grain, plump and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were shriveled and withered by the east wind. And these heads swallowed up the 7 plump, well-formed heads. Then Pharaoh woke up again and realized that it was a dream. The next morning, Pharaoh was very disturbed by the dream, so he called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. When Pharaoh told them his dreams, not one of them could tell him what they meant. And maybe we ought to say not one of them was willing to risk his head by telling him what it meant. They may have had a sense of what the dream meant and didn't want to say so. I don't know. The text isn't clear enough for us here. It just says that none of Pharaoh's magicians and wise men could tell him what the dreams meant. And recall that those days people were highly superstitious, and there was a lot of belief in mystical explanations of what's going on in the world. So almost every king had persons who specialized in mysticism. Well, if you're going to specialize in mysticism and in foretelling the future, you have to be careful, because if you get it wrong, you could not just lose your job, but lose your head in the process. So these men either couldn't figure out what the dreams meant, or possibly were unwilling to tell Pharaoh what the dreams meant. And I'm going to state my own belief about what might, I don't believe it as absolutely true, but it's something that might have happened, that might have caused the phenomena that we're about to describe here. Verse 9, finally the king's chief cupbearer spoke up. Today I have been reminded of my failure, he told Pharaoh. Some time ago you were angry with the chief baker and me, and you imprisoned us in the palace of the captain of the guard. One night the chief baker and I each had a dream, and each dream had its own meaning. There was a young Hebrew man with us in the prison who was a slave of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he told us what each of our dreams meant. And everything happened just as he had predicted. I was restored to my position as cupbearer, and the chief baker was executed and impaled on a pole. Pharaoh sent for Joseph at once, and he was quickly brought from the prison. After he shaved and changed his clothes, he went and stood before Pharaoh. Now, I'm not an Egyptologist, but I have heard that if you were an Egyptian and that shaving involved not just the facial hair, but the entire body. So when Joseph gets out of prison and shaves, he would have shaved his entire body and then changed his clothes. And then he went in and stood before Pharaoh. And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream last night, but no one here can tell me what it means. But I have heard that when you hear about a dream, you can interpret it. It is beyond my power to do this, Joseph replied, but God can tell you what it means and set you at ease. So Pharaoh told Joseph his dream. In my dream, he said, I was standing on the bank of the Nile River, and I saw 7 fat, healthy cows come up out of the river and begin grazing in the marsh grass. But then I saw 7 sick-looking cows, scrawny and thin, come up after them. I've never seen such sorry-looking animals in all the land of Egypt. These thin, scrawny cows ate the 7 fat cows, but afterward you wouldn't have known it, for they were still as thin and scrawny as before. Then I woke up. That's the detail that I didn't read before, but I remembered this detail, and that is that after the scrawny cows ate the fat cows, the scrawny cows were still scrawny. Then I woke up, Pharaoh says. In my dream, I also saw 7 heads of grain, full and beautiful, growing on a single stalk. Then 7 more heads of grain appeared, but these were blighted, shriveled, and withered by the east wind. And the shriveled heads swallowed up the 7 healthy heads. I told these dreams to the magicians, but no one could tell me what they mean. Joseph responded, both of Pharaoh's dreams mean the same thing. God is telling Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. The 7 healthy cows and the 7 healthy heads of grain both represent 7 years of prosperity. The 7 thin, scrawny cows that came up later and the 7 thin heads of grain, withered by the east wind, represent 7 years of famine. This will happen just as I have described it, for God has revealed to Pharaoh in advance what he is about to do. The next 7 years will be a period of great prosperity throughout the land of Egypt. But afterward there will be 7 years of famine so great that all the prosperity will be forgotten in Egypt. Famine will destroy the land. This famine will be so severe that even the memory of the good years will be erased. As for having 2 similar dreams, it means these events have been decreed by God and he will soon make them happen. Now, is Joseph saying that God is going to inflict a severe famine on the land? He says God's about to do it. Until we remember this Hebrew penchant for attributing everything to God's action, regardless of whether God did it or whether God just allowed it. So there's a famine coming, And God has seen fit to warn Pharaoh ahead of time, and through Joseph provide for the 7 years of famine so that Joseph's family will be saved. Because recall that Jesus came to this earth in the line of Judah. So for that to happen, Judah needs to survive. And Joseph is going to be God's agent for that salvation. Now, if we say that God didn't send the famine, then where did it come from? Well, in that part of the world, there are famines from time to time. Famines happen in Africa. We've had several famines during my lifetime in Africa, where the rest of the world has had to provide food aid to countries in Africa because of the famine, so that we reduce the number of people who die of starvation during these famines.
You know, we can hit that closer to home than you're probably aware of. It was a few years back, maybe 10 or so years back, we ran out of pumpkin. You could not buy pumpkin in this country.
Yeah. That wasn't an overall famine, but it was.
It was called the pumpkin famine.
Yeah. At any rate, now let me just spiel you my off in la la land theory about this. I read in a book many years ago the idea that after the flood, human technology advanced rather quickly, because recall that right after the flood, people were still living for hundreds of years. Shem lived for 502 years after the flood, and other people lived for 200 years each. So that would have allowed technology to advance faster because of the longer productive lifespan of each individual. And this author suggested that there was evidence that the people in the immediately post-flood era developed the technology of flight, and possibly also developed the technology of nuclear weapons. And that all of that at some point got wiped out and lost to humanity because those who had the ability to produce and deploy nuclear weapons deployed them against each other and caused major disruptions in the world. And in fact, that may have been the start of a nuclear winter that brought about the Ice Age, where the Earth was covered with glaciers and ice over a large area, much larger than is covered with ice today.
Would that explain what's going on in Antarctica?
Who knows? So, if that's the case, someone like Joseph, aware of the news of the world, may have been aware that the disruptions in climate based on this nuclear holocaust would cause 7 years of exceptionally productive weather, followed by 7 years of famine. And what it would be like after that, it's not clear. We do know that after the flood, the the mountains that include Everest, the Himalaya mountains, have been increasing in altitude, and as they increase in altitude, the area of arid land, of desert, grows. So the Sahara Desert has grown over the years as a result of this increase in the elevation of the Himalayas. And we've already suggested that that can explain how Israel was a land flowing with milk and honey in the Old Testament, but by our day is productive but still arid land. That area of desert has been expanding and has included that. But it is possible that this major climatic disruption, 14 years of unusual climate, could have been set off as a result of nuclear war someplace else that caused a major upset in the weather systems of the world. But even if not, this kind of a disruption may well have been, if not the work of humans, at least the work of Satan, trying to wipe out God's people. And God has set about to short circuit the deceiver's plans by sending someone like Joseph to say what he's about to say, starting here in verse 33. Because now that he's interpreted the dream, he's going to give Pharaoh a little advice. Therefore, Pharaoh should find an intelligent and wise man and put him in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh should appoint supervisors over the land and let them collect 1/5 of all the crops during the 7 good years. In other words, impose a 20% tax. Have them gather all the food produced in the good years that are just ahead and bring it to Pharaoh's storehouses. Store it away and guard it so there will be food in the cities. That way there will be enough to eat when the 7 years of famine come to the land of Egypt. Otherwise, this famine will destroy the land. Joseph's suggestions were well received by Pharaoh and his officials. So Pharaoh asked his officials, "Can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God?" And then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has revealed the meaning of the dreams to you, clearly no one else is as intelligent or wise as you are. You will be in charge of my court, and all my people will take orders from you. Only I, sitting on my throne, will have a rank higher than yours."
He just got placed above his owner.
Yeah. And his owners,
About that, Mrs. Potiphar.
I was going to say, and over the owner's scheming wife. Yes. And, as we know from knowing this story, over his parents and his brothers. And maybe now is the time to discuss this briefly. Most of you are familiar enough with this story to know what Joseph is about to do when his brothers show up. And traditionally, we interpret everything Joseph did as good and wonderful. Well, certainly, his willingness to forgive his brothers is a very good thing and demonstrates why someone like Joseph would be with God, as we have suggested. If God was with him, then he was with God. But that doesn't say that everything he did was entirely the best choice that could have been made. It's just the choices that he made and the things he did. And as we read them, we'll talk about why he might have felt it necessary to do what he did.
Well, his brothers were kind of stupid to not catch on.
Well, recall that when they sold Joseph, he was 17. He's going to be 30 at this point. So there will have been 13 years between, well, actually, he's going to be 37 by the time the brother, or more by the time the brothers meet him. So it's going to have been, it's going to have been like 20 years since they last saw him. And he will be fully shaven, no beard, which he probably had by the time he was 17 when they sold him. Might have been a little scraggly, but he probably had one. And so he would be dressed as an Egyptian, and having been away from him for 20 years, I don't think there was any reason for them to recognize who he was until he revealed himself. And then, yeah, they probably said, well, you know, yeah, we should have been able to figure that out. But we'll get to that part of the story after a bit. So Pharaoh asked his officials, can we find anyone else like this man, so obviously filled with the Spirit of God? So we already read that where Pharaoh tells Joseph, only I sitting on my throne will have a rank higher than yours. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. Then he had Joseph ride in the chariot reserved for his second in command. And wherever Joseph went, the command was shouted, kneel down. So Pharaoh put Joseph in charge of all Egypt. And Pharaoh said to him, I am Pharaoh, but no one will lift a hand or foot in the entire land of Egypt without your approval. Then Pharaoh gave Joseph a new Egyptian name. Now we know that the name Daniel is a Hebrew name, and that Daniel and his 3 friends were all given Babylonian names, so that Daniel became
Belshazzar.
Belteshazzar, and Hananiah became, well, Mishael became Meshach, Hananiah became Abednego. No, Azariah became Abednego, and Hananiah became Shadrach. And I think I pointed this out before. We often say Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but you're using Daniel's Hebrew names and then the 3 friends' Babylonian names. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah would be using all the Hebrew names, or Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would be using all the Babylonian names. But it's not such a well-known thing that Joseph also got renamed when Pharaoh put him in charge of Egypt. And that name was Zaphanath-Paneah. And let's see. Zaphanath-Paneah probably means God speaks and lives. So they're not sure. That's just the best they can tell. He also gave him a wife, whose name was Asenath. She was the daughter of Potipharah, the priest of On. Greek version reads of Heliopolis, also in 4150. And that may simply be based on the Greek version of the Old Testament having been prepared in Egypt, and so the Jews would have learned from the Egyptians where the city of On was and found out that it was now known as Heliopolis, and used that in the Greek version. And it says also in 4150, as well as there in 4145, as we've just read it. So Joseph took charge of the entire land of Egypt. He was 30 years old when he began serving in the court of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. So how are we going to divide out those 13 years? Well, it was 2 years from the time that he interpreted the baker and cupbearer's dreams. So that takes us to 11. Let's guess that maybe he was in prison for 2 years before that. That takes us back to about 9, which means he would have been a slave of Potiphar for, around 10 years, 8 or more. Who knows how many exactly. It would have taken a few years for him to gain the trust of Potiphar and end up in charge of his household. So we're dividing up the 13 years, and we know where 2 of them are for sure, because it was from the time that Joseph interpreted the dreams until now. And now he's 30 years old. So he was 28 when he interpreted the dreams. He was 17 when he left home. He got 11 years there to divide up however you think it should be. He was 30 years old when he began serving in the court of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and when Joseph left Pharaoh's presence, he inspected the entire land of Egypt. As predicted, for 7 years the land produced bumper crops. During those years, Joseph gathered all the crops grown in Egypt and stored the grain from the surrounding fields in the cities. He piled up huge amounts of grain like sand on the seashore. Finally, he stopped keeping records because there was too much to measure. During this time, before the first of the famine years, 2 sons were born to Joseph and his wife Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, the priest of On, or Heliopolis. City of the sun, by the way, is what Heliopolis means. Joseph named his older son Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my troubles and everyone in my father's family. Footnote, Manasseh sounds like a Hebrew term that means causing to forget. Joseph named his second son Ephraim, for he said, God has made me fruitful in this land of my grief. And Ephraim sounds like a Hebrew term that means fruitful. At last, the 7 years of bumper crops throughout the land of Egypt came to an end. Then the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had predicted. The famine also struck all the surrounding countries, but throughout Egypt there was plenty of food. Eventually, however, the famine spread throughout the land of Egypt as well, and when the people cried out to Pharaoh for food, he told them, go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you to do, or whatever he tells you. So, with severe famine everywhere, Joseph opened up the storehouses and distributed grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout the land of Egypt. And people from all around came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe throughout the world. Now, throughout the world would have been, the area around Egypt that the people were aware of. Certainly that Sahara had begun spreading, so the countries in northern Africa are experiencing very similar things to what's going on in Egypt, and this would have spread up into what we call today Palestine, and probably also in India and China and what parts of Europe would have been inhabited at those times. And anybody who could reach Egypt went to Egypt to buy food because the land wasn't producing any, but because of Joseph, Egypt had food. Chapter 42, Joseph's brothers go to Egypt. Now, we don't know how long this took. It might be a year or two after the famine. So when Jacob heard that grain was available in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why are you standing around looking at one another? I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy enough grain to keep us alive, otherwise we'll die." So Joseph's 10 older brothers went down to Egypt to buy grain. But Jacob wouldn't let Joseph's younger brother Benjamin go with them, for fear that some harm might come to him. So Jacob's sons arrived in Egypt along with others to buy food, for the famine was in Canaan as well. And that footnote A, I'll look it up here in a moment, probably is going to tell us that the Hebrew says Israel there, but it means the same thing. Yes, Hebrew, Israel. See the note on chapter 35, verse 21. All right, and I also saw the other footnotes, so maybe I'll remember that when we get to it. So Israel's sons arrived in Egypt along with others to buy food, for the famine was in Canaan as well. Since Joseph was governor of all Egypt and in charge of selling grain to all the people, it was to him that his brothers came. When they arrived, they bowed before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph recognized his brothers instantly, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where are you from?" he demanded. "From the land of Canaan," they replied. "We have come to buy food." Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they didn't recognize him. And he remembered the dreams he'd had about them many years before, 20 or more years before. And he said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see how vulnerable our land has become." Was that a reasonable accusation? Was it possible that the famine made Egypt vulnerable? And was it possible that surrounding nations might seek to take advantage of it by sending spies to find out if they could take advantage of Egypt's weakness in this famine? I think that's possible, so that Joseph's accusation, while he knew it wasn't true, wasn't entirely out of the expectation. And I say that to suggest that the other Egyptians around Joseph who are observing him dealing with these strangers from the land of Canaan harshly like this might believe that a wise man like Joseph could see something in these men that they couldn't see, and had reason to believe that Joseph was making an accurate accusation here in accusing them of being spies. "No, my lord," they exclaimed, "your servants have simply come to buy food. We are all brothers, members of the same family. We are honest men, sir. We're not spies." "Yes, you are," Joseph insisted. "You have come to see how vulnerable our land has become." "Sir," they said, "there are actually 12 of us. We, your servants, are all brothers, sons of a man living in the land of Canaan. Our youngest brother is back there with our father right now, and one of our brothers is no longer with us." Can you imagine what Joseph is thinking as he listens to this story? First of all, his full brother Benjamin gets mentioned here. The youngest brother is back there with our father right now. Joseph knows they're referring to Benjamin, so he knows Benjamin is Well, he survived and he's there with father. So dad's still looking out for him. He knows from this tale that his father is still living, but he has to hide his emotions and continue to present himself to these brothers as an angry Egyptian official who suspects that they are spies. But Joseph insisted, "As I said, you are spies. This is how I will test your story. I swear by the life of Pharaoh that you will never leave Egypt unless your brother comes here. One of you must go and get your brother. I'll keep the rest of you here in prison. Then we'll find out whether or not your story is true. By the life of Pharaoh, if it turns out that you don't have a younger brother, then I'll know you are spies." Well, does Joseph know that they have a younger brother? Of course he does. This is an act he's putting on. Why is he doing it this way? Well, in part, I think, he wants to ferret out their real attitude toward his brother. Because recall that what they did to Joseph was traumatic in the extreme. And Joseph, at this point, can't trust them. He may or may not have known what Reuben intended to do and how distressed Reuben was when he got sold. He may or may not have known that Judah was the one who came up with the idea of selling him. He only knows what his brothers have done to him, and he doesn't want to trust them until he finds out what they're like. And he's doing something that we would suggest is quite wise here, because humans are very good at wearing masks, at hiding who we really are so that people don't know what we're really like, because we want them to see us in a good light. So we want to hide our negative aspects from them. Joseph knows this. Joseph knows that if he's going to see what they're really like, then he's going to have to put them under stress. Now, there's going to be several levels of stress that he imposes on them here in order to find out what they're really like now. What are their attitudes? Have they changed any? And this accusation that they're spies is the first level of that stress that he's applying. Now, he's also putting stress on them by imprisoning them. I'm going to put you all in prison and send just one back to your father and to get your brother, to bring your brother here. So Joseph put them all in prison for 3 days. On the third day, Joseph said to them, "I am a God-fearing man. If you do as you say, you will live. If you really are honest men, choose one of your brothers to remain in prison. The rest of you may go home with grain for your starving families." Well, this shows that Joseph understands the difficulties of his father's family. He also understands that just one brother would not be able to take enough grain back to Canaan to help the family survive until he is done testing his brothers. So he decides, I'll just keep one brother. Now, that was probably in his mind all along, but he keeps them in prison for 3 days to give them the sense that he is really serious about his accusations and that they had better toe the line carefully, or they'll be in bigger trouble than they already are. The rest of you may go home with grain for your starving families, but you must bring your youngest brother back to me. This will prove that you are telling the truth, and you will not die. So he's actually threatening the death penalty against his brothers if they don't bring Benjamin with them the next time. Speaking among themselves, they said, here's a most poignant quotation. And again, Joseph would have had to stand there and listen to this impassively. Clearly, we are being punished because of what we did to Joseph long ago. We saw his anguish when he pleaded for his life, but we wouldn't listen. That's why we're in this trouble. Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? Reuben asked. But you wouldn't listen, and now you have to answer for his blood. Well, here's Reuben being Reuben. Reuben didn't want them to do what they did. Reuben didn't even know about the plot to sell him. He knew about the plot to kill him. He convinced him to throw him into a pit, thinking he'd come back by himself later and rescue Joseph and send him back to his father. We remember reading that part. So when he finds out that they've sold Joseph and he can't return him to his father, he's most upset. And so he's taking advantage of this opportunity to chide his brothers for their actions. And they're speaking Hebrew. So of course they didn't know that Joseph understood them, for he had been speaking to them through an interpreter. In other words, he had some Egyptian who knew Hebrew. He used him to interpret, even though he knew fully what was going on, didn't need an interpreter. But he's using one in order to maintain this image that he's presenting to his brothers. Now he turned away from them and began to weep. Weeping because, in part, of what he's doing to his brothers, but weeping because he realizes that he's beginning to see signs that they do regret what they have done. When he regained his composure, he spoke to them again. Then he chose Simeon from among them and had him tied up right before their eyes. Now that's interesting, because earlier he told them to choose one of your brothers to remain in prison. But then he doesn't give them the choice. He chooses a brother to keep. Now, the brothers were born in this order: Simeon, Levi, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Now, Reuben, Joseph is probably choosing not to put Reuben in prison because he's seeing here, and he may have known to some extent, that Reuben had been against what his brothers did to him. And he's seeing it again. So he doesn't want to punish Reuben. But he knows what Simeon and Levi were like, and Simeon being older than Levi, he picked Simeon to stay in prison while the other brothers go back. And in part, that may have been because Joseph knew what Simeon and Levi had done back at Shechem. And he understood Simeon's cruelty. And so, perhaps a bit of punishment for his cruelty, but also using him to ensure that his brothers come back and that they bring Benjamin with them when they come. And he has Simeon tied up right before them, so they know He's the one that Joseph has chosen to stay in prison while they go back to Canaan. Then Joseph ordered his servants to fill the men's sacks with grain, but he also gave secret instructions to return each brother's payment at the top of his sack. He also gave them supplies for their journey home. So the brothers loaded their donkeys with the grain and headed for home. But when they stopped for the night and one of them opened his sack to get grain for his donkey, he found his money in the top of his sack. "Look," he exclaimed to his brothers. It doesn't tell us which one, just says one of them. "My money has been returned. It's here in my sack." Then their hearts sank. Trembling, they said to each other, "What has God done to us?" Now, you can interpret this one of two ways. You could interpret Joseph returning the money as being an opportunity, as being an attempt to be nice to them. Here, you don't have to buy the grain. I'll give it to you for free. You can have it. I'm returning your money. But he didn't tell them that. They didn't know it until they'd opened their sacks on the journey home and found their money there. And that caused them further distress. So I think that Joseph's motives are double here. Yes, he does want to give them the grain for free. They're his brothers after all. But I think he's smart enough. I mean, that's part of what's going on with this whole story. He's smart enough to know what Potiphar's wife has in mind. He's smart enough to run the household of Potiphar. He's smart enough to run the prison. He's smart enough to run the whole land of Egypt. Surely he's not dumb enough to not be able to foresee what it's going to do to his brothers when they find their money back in their sacks. And perhaps that is intentionally another level of stress that he's placing on them in order to test them. When the brothers came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him everything that had happened to them. The man who is governor of the land spoke very harshly to us, they told him. He accused us of being spies, scouting out the land. But we said we are honest men, not spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of one father. One brother is no longer with us, and the youngest is at home with our father in the land of Canaan. Then the man who is governor of the land told us, "This is how I will find out if you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers here with me and take grain for your starving families and go on home. But you must bring your youngest brother back to me. Then I will know you are honest men and not spies. Then I will give you back your brother, and you may trade freely in the land." As they emptied out their sacks, there in each man's sack was the bag of money he had paid for the grain. The brothers and their father were terrified when they saw the bags of money. Jacob exclaimed, "You are robbing me of my children. Joseph is gone, Simeon is gone, and now you want to take Benjamin too? Everything is going against me." Now here's a question for you. Did Joseph intend to put his father under this kind of stress? Or was Joseph operating under the concept that, yes, there'll be collateral damage, but it's necessary to achieve what I want to? Yes, Dad will be stressed and upset by the demands I'm making of my brothers, but it's necessary to find out what my brothers are really like. At any rate, we can sense Jacob's distress here. Joseph is gone, Simeon is gone, now you want to take Benjamin too. Everything's going against me. Simeon is gone, probably didn't disturb him, but certainly Joseph did, and certainly Benjamin would. Then Reuben said to his father, "You may kill my 2 sons if I don't bring Benjamin back to you." I'll be responsible for him, and I promise to bring him back. So Reuben is thinking, we need to go back to Egypt right away and get this settled and get Simeon back. And so he's negotiating with Jacob to get Jacob to allow Benjamin to go with them so they can go back to Egypt and get this whole mess sorted out right away. And he's even said, I'll put the life of my 2 sons up as surety that I'm going to bring Benjamin back to you. I'll be responsible for him. But Jacob replied, my son will not go down with you. His brother Joseph is dead, as far as he knows, that's true, and he is all I have left. If anything should happen to him on your journey, you would send this grieving white-haired man to his grave. There's your second footnote. We can see the name of the text of the footnote there. B. For verse 38, the Hebrew says to Sheol. But Sheol is the place of the dead, the grave. That's, it was the choice of the King James to render Sheol as hell whenever they thought it ought to be hell instead of something else. So, and we have reached the end of a second chapter, and we have been covering the story of Joseph testing his brothers, and we're kind of in the middle of all that testing. And again, like the last few weeks, we're a little bit short of our full hour and a half, but still I think this is a good place for us to stop. And we'll continue with chapter 43 next week. We certainly hope that you will join us then. And until then, we say goodbye and God bless.